Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was saying about 10 days ago when we gathered here, said the spring is with us. Definitely, the spring is with us now at this moment. But I still wonder, the spring has come for the global economy yet. There are still clouds of uncertainty. Maybe not that heavy cloud, but still cloud is hanging around the global economy. This morning we have the best speaker to tell us what's happening in the global economy and what is going to happen in the global economy. David Hale was here before with us. He is one of the most distinguished practicing macroeconomists, and you might call him business economist. He worked mostly in the private sector and financial community. He was the chief economist and also chief global economist for financial groups like Zurich Financial Services, and he advised this group, and also he consulted widely at various financial institutions, and also he advised the U.S. government and the U.S., not only U.S. Treasury, but the Federal Reserve Bank, and he frequently appear at congressional the testimonies and so forth. His service in the business community and financial sector was recognized by awarding him by the New York chapter of National Associations of Business Economists. They awarded with the William F. Butler Award, who was previous the awardees was Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, and Nobel laureate Lawrence Klein, and many others. So he is that distinguished business economist who contributes articles in Financial Times, and Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post, and New York Times, and very frequently he gives a lecture and everywhere. So I'm very pleased to have David Hale this morning with us. He was here but he is on his way to Hong Kong. Just I corrected him to come to Seoul and spend some time with us. Well, with this, please join me in welcoming.
It's a great pleasure to be here this morning, come back to Korea after a few years and to see people I met with when I was here a couple of years ago. Your economy confronts numerous challenges, both external and domestic, and I'm sure that the year ahead will be a challenging economy for the Korean economy as it will be for the larger global economy. If I was going to summarize the overall state of play in the global economy, I'd say it's characterized by a number of contradictory forces. We have at the current time an unprecedented amount of central bank easing in the major industrial countries, in the U.S., in Britain, now Japan. And what this has given us over the last 2 years is not a major robust recovery of the economy. What it's given us instead is very robust asset markets. We've had very large gains in share prices, and we've had quite robust commodity markets as well. So easy monetary policy is working, but it's not working through all the traditional channels that would have given it the possibility of offering us a high rate of economic growth in years past. And that's because in this recovery, in this cycle, we have had some important differences with previous post-war business cycles. Let's focus first on the U.S. economy. America this June will be entering the 5th year of economic recovery after the great downturn which occurred back in 2008, early 2009. And this recovery has been, by historical standards, relatively subdued. The growth rates averaged only around 2%. The unemployment rate is still 7.7%. That's a very, very high level of unemployment for an economy which has had almost 4 years of recovery. And it reflects the fact that the recent downturn was quite unusual compared to any previous post-war recession. The downturn was not caused by Federal Reserve policy driving up interest rates to try and stop inflation. It was caused instead by a financial crisis centering on the U.S. residential real estate market. We had, in the first half of the previous decade, a great real estate boom, large gains in house prices, huge increases in mortgage lending. And much of this lending went to people who could not service their debt. So by 2007, 2008, we had a huge increase in the default rate on our mortgage loans, and this did create major problems for the banking system and major problems for the asset markets. Indeed, it gave us, in 2008 and 2009, the worst global recession in modern times. So this has been a very, very unusual kind of economic recovery because of the legacy of the financial crisis. And the great legacy was, during this residential downturn, back 4 or 5 years ago, the American household sector had $7 trillion of wealth losses, unprecedented wealth losses on its homes, on its residential real estate. And because of these very large wealth losses, we did have a major constraint on consumer spending. The growth rate of consumer spending has been, by all historical standards, quite subdued. And this, of course, had spillover effects on the rest of the economy. Now, in recent months, there have been some signs of improvement in the economy. There are indications that the American economy's growth rate has the potential, over the next 12 or 18 months, to possibly get back in the range of 3 or 3.5%. And there are right now 6 major positive forces at work. The first is the monetary policy I mentioned a minute ago. American monetary policy right now is more expansionary than at any time in our history. The core Federal Reserve lending rate is close to 0. The Federal Reserve Board is now expanding its balance sheet by $85 billion per month, purchasing both government debt and mortgage securities. This is truly unprecedented. The Federal Reserve balance sheet is now over $3 trillion, compared to only $800 billion back in the autumn of 2008, before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Secondly, the American corporate sector has experienced, over the last 4 years, a very dramatic recovery in corporate profits. They have more than doubled. And the profit share of GDP is now at the highest level in 60 years. This has given the corporate sector the resources to increase capital spending. In 2011, we had very large gains in capital spending. The numbers moderated during 2012 because of uncertainty about U.S. fiscal policy. But in recent months, we're again seeing signs of strength in capital spending. This is very much a byproduct of the fact that firms currently are earning a very high rate of return on their new investment. Thirdly, the household sector has been deleveraging after these very large wealth losses. Over the last 4 years, the household sector has reduced its debt by about $1.3 trillion. And because of low interest rates, the household sector's debt servicing ratio has fallen from over 14% down to only 11%. This, of course, has been a positive for freeing up consumer income to spend on goods and services. Fourth, the American housing market, after 5 years of recession, 5 years of very weak prices, and big job losses in the construction sector, is showing true signs of recovery. We've now had a year of very good gains in home sales. We've had a recovery in residential construction. And home prices now, year on year, are up about 8%. And some of the very depressed markets of 3 and 4 years ago, like Arizona, they're up 23%. So housing is now finally making a contribution to the recovery after 5 years in which its impact was all negative. And this has great potential for creating more employment. Because during the downturn 5 years ago, we lost 2.3 million construction jobs. We've so far regained only about 300,000. So if we can sustain the housing recovery over the next 2 years, we could easily add several 100,000 new jobs to the economy. And that, of course, would help to lower the unemployment rate. Fifth, the American banking system has had a healthy recovery from the downturn 4 and 5 years ago. Bank equity asset ratios are now over 11%, compared to only 9% 4 years ago. Bank profits are now the highest they've been since 2006. And this recovery in the banking system is positive because when banks have good balance sheets, when they can earn good rates of return on capital, they're more willing to make new loans. So the credit environment now is more positive than it was 3 and 4 years ago. Back in 2008 and 9, credit access was a major problem. That's no longer the case today. And finally, the U.S. is now in the midst of a great oil and gas boom. Our oil production has increased from 5.5 million barrels per day a few years ago to 7.3 million barrels today. And by 2020, America could be producing 10 million barrels per day, as much oil as is now produced by Russia and Saudi Arabia. And there's great potential for developing new reserves. The reserves, according to Cambridge Energy, at the oil price of $60 a barrel, we have 25 billion barrels of oil which could be developed. If the oil price goes to $90 per barrel, that figure increases to 37 billion barrels. So we have, with high oil prices, great potential for further enhancing American oil output. This is also creating jobs. Unconventional oil production last year supported 1.7 million jobs. By the year 2020, unconventional oil could be producing as many as 3 million jobs. This is also having a positive impact on the American trade deficit. The decline in oil imports over the last 2 or 3 years has reduced the U.S. trade deficit by about $70 billion. As we keep increasing production, there'll be further potential over the next 5 years to lower that trade deficit yet again. So the oil and gas sector now is very much a big positive for the U.S. economy. It's already had an important impact on the economy, but there's still far more to go for over the next 4 or 5 years. The great constraint on U.S. growth this year is American fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has turned quite restrictive here in the last year after being very expansionary back in 2009 and early 2010. And this restraint's taking a variety of forms. First, we had an increase in our payroll taxes in January. They went from 4% to 6%. The Congress and the President cut the payroll tax back in 2010 to promote the economy, but they allowed the tax cut to lapse in January. So this will be for the American people a $120 billion tax increase. The Congress and the President also decided back in January to raise marginal income tax rates on high-income people from 35% to 40%. This will also raise taxes by about $40 billion. And we're also now in the midst of new spending cuts. We began a process 3 weeks ago called sequestration, which mandates across-the-board spending cuts in discretionary programs. These spending cuts will fall quite heavily on the Pentagon, but they will also affect a wide range of domestic discretionary programs in areas like education, R&D research, maintaining the air traffic control system, infrastructure, and things like that. And we're getting the sequestration because the White House and the Congress could not 2 years ago agree on a truly coherent long-term program for deficit reduction. So in place of having a coherent program, they agreed to have this sequestration of spending. And if we don't agree to a new program over the next few years, we will have by 2022 over $1 trillion of sequestration. And this will be both a drag on the economy, and it also could be quite damaging to some very important public goods, like government spending on R&D, on the air traffic control system, on education funding for a wide range of different groups of students that rely on federal scholarships. So this is potentially quite disruptive. Now, the impasse in Washington over fiscal policy reflects the fact that our two major political parties are quite far apart. The Republicans don't want to enact any new tax increases. They're very religious. They're very dogmatic about this issue. They don't want new tax increases. And most Republicans oppose the tax increase we had back in January on high-income people. So the very fact that occurred has made them even more determined to resist possible new tax increases. The problem for the White House and for Democrats in Congress is they don't want to reduce the spending on federal entitlements program, things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And Medicare is a very major problem for the American economy. With an aging population, Medicare spending is now increasing very rapidly. It could go from less than 4% of GDP last year, 10 or 12% by 2040, 2050. It is the major, major challenge facing U.S. fiscal policy over the next 20 or 30 years. Republicans have a program to control Medicare spending by effectively privatizing the service, having the government buy people private insurance policies to provide their health care needs. Democrats have so far been opposed to that. In fact, Democrats have been opposed to any reforms at all in the program. So because of this impasse, it's very unclear how U.S. fiscal policy will develop over the next few years. I'd like to think that at some point the two sides could find a way to compromise. Recently, President Obama has asked Republican senators to come out and have dinner with him. This is a first attempt on his part to try and promote some negotiations. But because the two sides are very far apart, we don't yet know exactly how it's going to play out. So fiscal policy will linger in the year ahead as the major uncertainty, the major unknown for the U.S. economy. But the momentum we have right now in the private sector is pretty good. If we did not have these problems of government fiscal policy, I could easily predict a growth rate this year above 3%. But because there will be fiscal drag from tax increases and spending cuts, it's more likely that our growth rate will again be closer to 2% than 3%. So we'll have a fifth year of growth, still constrained by these policy issues, these policy uncertainties. If we turn to Europe, the economic challenges are quite different. And the major challenges in Europe in the last 2 years have centered very much on resolving the contradictions created by European Monetary Union back in 1998. And at that time, a dozen European countries agreed to get rid of their currencies and go instead to a common European currency. And now, 12 years later, we have 17 countries in the Monetary Union. Several joined in the last decade after the Union was established. And this Union so far has created three major contradictions, three major problems for the European economy. First, it led to a big decline in interest rates in Ireland and Spain. And this big drop in interest rates helped trigger a major real estate boom. Huge increases in construction activity, huge increases in residential real estate prices, and across the board boom in the property sector. And by 2008, this boom was rapidly expiring, rapidly unwinding. And this set the stage for banks in both countries to have record losses. In 2008 and 2009, the Irish government had to spend almost 50% of GDP on bank rescues. And the effect on Irish fiscal policy was quite traumatic. Back in 2007, Ireland's ratio of government debt to GDP was only around 30%. Now, because of the cost of these bank rescues and a very severe recession, Irish government debt is over 100% of GDP. Secondly, Greece was able to borrow money over the last decade at incredibly low interest rates. During this period, Greece had a very irresponsible fiscal policy. They had massive increases in public spending. If they had not had the European currency, they would have found it very, very difficult to fund these deficits. They would have had a huge increase in interest rates. But instead, as a result of the monetary union, Greece was able to borrow from the European markets at an interest rate spread of only 100 basis points above German bond yields. This was truly unique. And it showed that back in 2006 and 2007, the markets were overly complacent about Greece's fiscal situation. The markets believed, incorrectly, that monetary union would eliminate any problems of Greek government insolvency. But indeed, by 2009, the Greek government was effectively insolvent. Because of large deficits, they could no longer fund themselves. They had to turn to the European Union and the IMF for financial help. And we had, over the course of the last 2.5 years, 2 major rescue programs for the Greek government. But one side effect of these programs was, back in March of last year, Greece had to engage in a debt restructuring. And it reduced the value of its privately owned debt by about 70%. This was the worst debt default we've seen in recent economic history. And thirdly, during this period of monetary union over the last 12 years, we had in Europe tremendous divergences in unit labor costs, tremendous divergences in wage growth and productivity. Germany back in the mid-1990s had an inflation problem because of the high cost of unification. German industry became very concerned about their competitive position. So they appealed to the trade unions back in 1998, 1999 to pursue a long period of wage restraint to try and improve Germany's competitive position. And that policy was very successful. Germany had almost a decade or more with only token wage growth, while gains in productivity helped to reduce unit labor costs. This produced a whole decade of stagnation in German consumption, but it did make Germany a strong exporting nation. And by 2008 and 2009, Germany was the world's largest exporter of tradable goods. A great, great story in terms of export performance. Elsewhere in Europe, though, the situation was quite different. Italy had a decade with 3 and 3.5% growth in wages and no gains in productivity. The same happened in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. So over the course of the last decade, unit labor costs in Southern Europe increased by 30 or 35% compared to Germany. And this did have a very adverse effect on the competitive position of European countries suffering from this differential in unit labor costs. And the result has been a deterioration in their export performance. We can see this in the numbers on global foreign trade. The Italian share of global exports has fallen from 4.1% back in the early 1990s to only 2.5%. The French share has fallen from 5% to 3.3%. Europe in general has seen over the last 15 years a major decline in its share of global exports. And this very much reflects the fact that they do have a problem being competitive. So the monetary union did create these 3 contradictions. Now, the response to these problems so far has been a series of rescue programs. The first for Greece, then for Ireland, and then for Portugal. And we had another one last week for Cyprus. But the Cyprus rescue was simply an offshoot of the crisis in Greece. Cypriot banks did over the last decade buy a lot of Greek government debt. They've made lots of loans in Greece because the 2 countries are very similar in terms of language and culture. And the Greek debt default, therefore, had a catastrophic impact on the Cypriot banks. They were basically insolvent. And therefore, there had to be a rescue program for those banks. And Cyprus got that a few weeks ago from the EU and the IMF. The problem is the EU has insisted that Cyprus impose large losses on deposit holders in the Cypriot banks. This is the first time the EU and the IMF have asked for losses, not from bank shareholders or bank bondholders, but from people who had large bank deposits. And the EU did this because over the last 20 years, Cyprus has become a center for tax evasion and money laundering by Russian oligarchs. Cyprus had in its bank accounts 68 billion euros a few months ago, and probably a third of that belonged to Russian billionaires and Russian oligarchs. And the German government did not want to engage in a rescue program that would protect Russian oligarchs. So Germany insisted in negotiations over this rescue program that Cyprus should impose some very large losses on its deposit holders. So this will, over the next 2 or 3 years, have a catastrophic impact on the economy of Cyprus. It'll lead to a very severe recession and very, very high unemployment. Now, the rescue programs that we've had did require all these countries to engage in fiscal austerity, to reduce public spending or cut taxes to lower their fiscal deficits. The rescue programs also tried to promote structural reform, liberalization of labor markets, and other policies that would make these countries once again more flexible, more capable of having a recovery in productivity while containing unit labor costs. And this is now happening in all four countries at very diverse speeds in very diverse ways. But on the whole, these programs have been successful in stabilizing the European financial markets. There was at this time, a year ago, great fear that Greece might have to leave the monetary union. Greece was going to have an election. There was a great debate about its austerity program. And a very left-wing party said it would try and reject the austerity program and basically not have the cuts in public spending, the cuts in wages that came out of it. This party nearly won the election. And if they had won the election, I think by now Greece might have had to leave the monetary union. But instead, the voters supported two centrist parties, which have now been in coalition for the last year. Now, there are two major pillars, therefore, to the monetary union over the last 2 years. The first is in Germany. It's been the willingness of the Germans to support rescue programs for troubled countries. Back when the monetary union was being created 12 and 13 years ago, there was a great fear that something like this might happen. So the European countries had something called the Maastricht Treaty to restrain deficits, promote prudent fiscal policy. But the fact is, over the last decade, they ignored all these rules and created the circumstances where a crisis could develop. Now, the Germans believe the monetary union has been positive for them because if we had not had it here in the last 3 or 4 years, the old German Deutschmark would probably have gone up 30 or 40% compared to other European currencies. You would have had massive devaluations in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy to try and become more competitive. The kinds of things which happened previously in Europe back in the 1980s and 1990s. And the Germans did not want their exchange rate to appreciate dramatically for 3 reasons. First, in Germany, the manufacturing share of GDP is almost 25%. That's very high by industrial country standards. Manufacturing share of GDP in the U.S. is only about 10%, UK about 10%, Europe in general in the 15 or 20% range. Secondly, exports are half of German GDP. Again, a very high number compared to other industrial countries. And finally, 60% of those exports go to the rest of Europe. And if we had therefore had a major appreciation of the German Deutschmark, that would have severely damaged Germany's competitive position in the European market. So we have a situation where the German government feels monetary union is essential. Now, there is dissension on this issue in Germany. 2 weeks ago, a group of academics and a few business people launched a new political party opposing Germany's membership in the monetary union. These academics have been campaigning against it for many years. They have filed numerous lawsuits in the German courts protesting the monetary union. So far, they've been unsuccessful. They're a brand new group. It's unclear how they'll do in the German election in September. But the danger is all the votes they take will come at the expense of Angela Merkel, the current German chancellor. And if they do get 4 or 5% of the vote, they could jeopardize Merkel's ability to get reelected in September. So this is, in Germany, a whole new wild card. There's no way we can measure and predict right now exactly how it will play out. But the danger it poses, obviously, is a challenge to Mrs. Merkel's position as Germany's leader. The second major political factor which allows these rescue programs to go ahead is the willingness of countries, willingness of voters in troubled countries, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, to support the austerity policies that were the price of them getting rescue programs. It's quite remarkable how in these countries the electorates have been incredibly conservative. Back in late 2011, Spain had an election. The Conservative Party won the biggest landslide since the death of Franco back in 1975. And they ran very much on a program of austerity and fiscal reform to protect Spain's position in the monetary union. The same thing happened in Portugal. The same thing happened in Ireland. As I mentioned, it happened at this time last year as well in Greece. This is quite extraordinary. The willingness of European people to vote for austerity programs to stay in the monetary union. But the basic thinking is quite simple. Once you join a monetary union, there's no easy way to leave. If the markets begin to believe you're going to leave the monetary union, you'll have massive capital flight. In fact, in the year before the Greek election, last May, Greece lost a third of its bank deposits to capital flight. But if people had really thought Greece was going to leave the monetary union, you would have had even more dramatic capital flight. They might have lost 80% of their bank deposits, not 30%. Now, the new challenge to this political consensus has come in the last few weeks with an election in Italy. After a year and a half of being governed by Mario Monti, a technocratic prime minister who was assigned to try and promote reform in the Italian economy, Italy had an election in late February. The election produced a very gridlocked parliament. The Democratic Party, which is traditionally the Socialist Party, got about 30% of the vote and came in first. That gave them control of the lower house of the Italian parliament. But in the upper house, the Senate, no one won. The Democratic Party got about 117 seats. Berlusconi's party got about 112. He was the former prime minister. And a party led by a comedian called Beppe Grillo won about 55 seats. Mario Monti also campaigned in a centrist party. He only got about 12 or 13 votes. He did very badly indeed after being prime minister here for the last 15 or 16 months. So Italy right now is finding it very difficult to form a government. The president's asked the socialist leader to form a government because he's first place in the lower house. But he's now talked to the other parties, and they will not support him in forming a government with an adequate majority in the upper house. So Italy may have to have, in July or August or September, a new election. We don't know exactly how it will play out. Italy also must elect a new president in the next 2 weeks because the term of the current president ends on May 15th. This creates one more element of uncertainty. After the Italian election, there was a modest increase in Italian bond yields. They rose by about 50 basis points. But they're still below 5%, well below where they were a year ago. I think the obvious danger looking out 2 or 3 months is that if Italy cannot create a government, cannot resolve this impasse, Italian bond yields could increase by a couple hundred basis points. And given the fact that Italy has a huge public debt, 120% of GDP, this will be a real blow to the Italian government, to the Italian fiscal position. So Italy is the new cloud, the new uncertainty in the European continent, and there's no way of knowing exactly how it will play out. But I would say for the time being, Italy is simply ungovernable. And all we can do is watch and see how this plays out. And the problem with having a new election is it might not resolve anything. The opinion polls last week showed if we had a new election, Grillo's party would gain even more votes. It might get over 30% compared to 25% back in February. And the better he does, the more difficult it will be to form a government because he won't cooperate with anyone. He is simply a negative voice. He's a protest vote. And therefore, he cannot play any effective role in trying to create a new Italian government. The European Central Bank has played an important role here in the last year. They did back in early 2012 and late 2011 provide the European commercial banks with $1 trillion of liquidity to help resolve their funding problems. 12 and 18 months ago, the American money market funds would not roll over European bank CDs. They were very concerned about European asset quality. And this did create funding problems for European banks, so the ECB intervened in quite an aggressive way to help them out. Mario Draghi also made a promise back in August that he would work to maintain the monetary union indefinitely. This had a very powerful impact on market expectations because it meant that if a country had a financial problem, ECB might intervene to try and reduce their bond yields. But Draghi said he would only intervene under conditions. He wanted the troubled country to go to the EU with a formal aid request and then to have an aid program that would include conditions to promote better governance, better policy. And so far, no one's done that. About 6 months ago, the common expectation was Spain would go first in pursuing such a program. because Spain still has large fiscal deficits. But because of Draghi's promise, European bond yields simply collapsed, and therefore took away the pressure on Spain, Italy, and other countries to go to the European Central Bank and ask for financial help. But now that we have this new problem in Italy, it's possible that once again bond yields in Southern Europe will increase quite significantly. And if they do, then these countries may have to go to the EU and seek a formal rescue program so the European Central Bank can intervene to try and help reduce their bond yields. So that's the basic situation in Europe. We've now had a major test of the monetary union. We've had major problems in 3 or 4 countries. We've had rescue programs. And so far, these rescue programs have held up. They've had political support. But now the real test is going to be in Italy. And it's very unclear how Italy will resolve the issue of who will be the prime minister, who will lead the government. They may be forced to do what they did 15 months ago and find a new technocratic prime minister like Mario Monti. Not an elected official, but a prominent academic, maybe a former central banker, someone like that who could then try and organize a government that would not be based solely on political parties. But right now, we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. All we can do is watch and wait to see what happens in Rome over the next few months. The other troubled economy in Europe at the current time is France. As I mentioned, France has had over the last 20 years a major loss in its share of global trade. The unemployment rate in France is now over 11%. The new French government elected this time last year, led by Francois Hollande, is not having much luck with the economy. He's imposing lots of tax increases. He's very much carrying out what was a year ago the Socialist Manifesto, and this is not a positive for European growth. So at some point, I do think that market forces will force France to go to very different policies than it's had here in the last 12 months. What we don't know is how long it will take to do this. The bottom line, for those of you in business, is Europe will be in recession probably for much of this year. There'll be slightly positive growth in Germany, Austria, Finland, Sweden, but we will have an ongoing recession in Southern Europe and probably in France as well. So Europe will not be a good market in the year ahead for Korean exporters and for Korean industry. If we turn to Asia, the situation is much more divergent than it is in Europe. Let's focus first on Japan. Japan is now in the midst of a very dramatic change in economic policy. It began with the Japanese election back in December, which led to the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, forming a government again after being out of power for 3.5 years. During the election campaign, the LDP leader, Mr. Abe, campaigned quite aggressively for Japan to have an easier monetary policy. He alleged the previous Bank of Japan governor, Mr. Shirakawa, had not been aggressive enough in fighting deflation. And Japan has now had deflation nonstop since 1994. So he felt this was therefore a very important issue and one he wanted to campaign on. He also wanted to provide new changes in Japanese policy to promote a higher rate of economic growth. So the policy we call Abenomics is now evolving in 3 stages. The first is radical changes to the Bank of Japan. The term of the governor and 2 deputy governors expired a few weeks ago, back in mid-March. So Mr. Abe had the opportunity in January to name a new central bank president as well as 2 deputies. The man he chose for that job is Haruhiko Kuroda, who was 12 years ago Japan's vice minister for international policy at the Ministry of Finance. During this period, Kuroda was a major critic of the Bank of Japan. He wrote articles in the Financial Times criticizing Japanese monetary policy for not doing more to fight deflation. So he very much carved out a position as a critic of Japanese monetary policy. For other critics as well, we had some prominent academics like Ito who were critical of the Bank of Japan, a man called Kasamasu Iwata, who was deputy governor of the BOJ 5 years ago, now runs a policy center, also sharing the criticism. But Kuroda got the job, I think, because of both his opinions and also because of his Ministry of Finance background. In the modern period, Japan has typically rotated the BOJ governorship between BOJ bureaucrats and Ministry of Finance bureaucrats. And back 5 years ago, when a mock bureaucrat was supposed to take over, his appointment got blocked by the Democratic Party in the upper house of the Japanese Diet. This was a man called Muto. So when he was turned down, they turned instead to Mr. Shirakawa, who had spent 30 years at the Bank of Japan. He was a lifelong bureaucrat. So now with Kuroda coming in, Ministry of Finance again has somebody at the BOJ. The BOJ has a policy meeting tomorrow and Thursday, or today and Thursday. What they'll do, I think, is announce the massive expansion of the balance sheet, probably worth 30 or 40 trillion yen. And rather than just buying short-term government debt, they will buy long-term bonds, corporate bonds, equities, and real estate investment trusts. Kuroda will have a far more aggressive policy than his predecessor, Mr. Shirakawa. Will this be enough to give Japan an inflation rate of 2%? I'm skeptical, because even during the boom back in the 1980s, Japan didn't get an inflation rate much over 1%. But I do think aggressive stimulus has the possibility of at least ending deflation at some point in the next 2 years. It's also led to a very sharp depreciation in the value of the Japanese yen. It's gone from 78 back in September, 6 months ago, to now only around 94. That's almost an 18% depreciation. The Japanese stock market loves this policy change. Since October, it's rallied 40%. So the stock market's very much casting a vote of confidence in favor of Abe's new policy. Second dimension of Abe's policy is to have fiscal stimulus this year. He wants to spend 5 trillion yen more on infrastructure. Japan had, back in December, a tunnel collapse, killed 9 people. This led to a wave of press coverage about the fact that most of Japan's infrastructure was built back in the 1950s and is therefore getting old, and therefore needs a lot of new spending to maintain the quality of the bridges, the highways, the ports, other elements of the infrastructure. So we are going to get, in the year ahead, a lot of stimulus from infrastructure spending. And thirdly, Abe will over time have to pursue various microeconomic reforms to promote a higher rate of potential Japanese GDP growth. This means labor market reforms, reforms of the financial system, and also getting Japan to do more to promote foreign trade. Korea, over the last 5 years, has signed numerous free trade agreements with America, with Europe, with Turkey, soon with Canada. Japan has done very few FTAs because of its very protected agricultural sector. But Abe announced 2 weeks ago when he went to Washington he would have Japan try and join this new American-led trade coalition called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. That will include a variety of countries, some in North America, Canada, and Mexico, as well as the U.S., but also a variety of Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, Vietnam, and so on. So this is, for Japan, a very, very bold step because it will lead to contradictions, or it will lead to complaints on the part of Japanese farmers about the danger of rice imports and things like that. But the fact is, Abe now agrees that Japan must do more to protect its export markets, because with other countries having FTAs, there's a great danger that Japan will fall behind. Various economists are now saying that membership of the TPP could bolster Japanese growth by 0.5% over the next 5 years. So this is, for Japan, a very, very major political development, and all we can watch and wait to see how it plays out with the Japanese farmers and the Japanese diet. But right now, Japan has the highest agricultural tariffs in the world. For rice, it's over 700%. And it's not clear how the government will resolve that issue as we go forward. If we turn to China, we've had tremendous news here in the last 3 months about the country's leadership transition and how the economy will recover from the slowdown which occurred last year. Now, we have 2 major new leaders. We have Xi Jinping, who became president, as well as Communist Party secretary, and Li Ka-shing, who became the new premier. Li Ka-shing is quite remarkable in terms of his background. He has both a law degree and a PhD in economics. This is unprecedented in modern Chinese history. All Chinese leaders in the last 40 years have been trained as engineers. None have studied economics, law, or political science. So this means that Mr. Li is quite different from all his predecessors. And he has played a role behind the scenes here in recent years, shaping economic policy. A year ago, the World Bank produced a major report called China 2030. outlining all the great challenges China will face to maintain a high growth rate. He helped to write this report. He helped to endorse it. And this, to me, is a positive because it does suggest he'll be prepared over the next 10 years to promote very major structural changes to enhance the economy's performance in China. And there are, I think, 4 or 5 major areas of reform worth focusing on. The first is the reform of the so-called Hoku system. The Hoku system regulates internal migration. And basically what it means is that when a worker goes from a rural area, from the countryside to the cities, to get a new job, he does not maintain all of his citizenship rights. He cannot get his children into local schools. He can't qualify for certain social services. Because to get those services, he has to be a citizen of that town or of that community. And simply migrating does not guarantee that. And the fact is, China will need, over the next 30 years, lots of migration to maintain the economy's growth momentum. China's population is now aging quite rapidly. It's not as bad as Korea, but the trend's very much in the same direction. The labor force last year fell by 3 million people. The population of people aged 20 to 24 will fall from 116 million last year, 2010, to 94 million in 2020, and only 67 million in 2030. This means labor is going to be a major constraint on growth. But what China will have to do is move lots of people out of agriculture, out of the farms, into urban areas. And we're talking literally about the movement of 200 or 300 million people. And to do that, they will have to give these migrant workers full citizenship rights. So this will have to happen sometime in the next 2 or 3 years. Second major area for reform is liberalization of the financial system. China's had in the modern period very tight controls over the financial system. The government determining what banks can pay depositors and what it can charge for loans. And those interest rates have been invariably very, very low compared to China's very high growth rate. Bank deposits have yielded over the last 20 years 2 or 3%. Bank loans cost 6 or 6.5%. This is despite the fact that China's nominal GDP growth has been 15 and 16%. So we've got a very distorted financial system. And people in China don't like these very low yields because it means they often lose money after inflation because China's had many periods when inflation was 4, 5, or 6%, much higher than the yield on bank deposits. Now, what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is the banks have begun to invent new products to try and hold on to deposits. There's been a major growth in the last 2 years of what are called wealth management products. They offer a yield a couple hundred basis points over conventional bank deposits. And the banks earn these higher returns by making loans to real estate developers, local governments, other parties that need capital. And in just 2 years, these wealth management products have gone from almost zero share of Chinese bank deposits to now 8%. At the current growth rate, they could in 3 years be 25% of China's bank deposits. So we are getting back to our liberalization through these new products. The problem for the Chinese people is only wealthy people can buy these products because the standard price for buying these new products is 400,000 or 500,000 RMB, far more than the average person can afford. So we're creating in China a 2-tier banking system, giving good rates of return to the wealthy and very low rates of return to everyone else. And this, of course, will over time create political tension and political conflict. So what China will have to do over the next 3 to 5 years is liberalize the entire financial system, allow higher rates of return for all depositors, not just wealthy people. And this will be very important for the economy because the very low rate of return on bank deposits has constrained the growth of household income and also forced the sector to have a higher savings rate to achieve its wealth accumulation targets. And China does have at the current time one of the highest savings rate in the world. In the household sector, the savings rate has gone from 32% 15 years ago to 38%. And this is very much a byproduct of the fact that we have these very low rates of return on most household savings. So this will be for China a very important challenge over the next 3 or 4 years. Third challenge for China is creating an effective social safety net. for health care, education, and pensions. And if they had a larger, more effective social safety net, this would also help to lower the household savings rate. And one of the problems in China is how they distribute the money that goes for social services. They're mandated by the central government, but they're often provided by local governments. Local governments have to provide 60% of the funding for education and 40% for health care. And local governments often don't have adequate resources to carry out these responsibilities. Local governments often depend very heavily on real estate sales to fund themselves. So we will have to strengthen the social safety. That'll mean probably more central government funding for services currently provided by local governments. Fourth area for action is the environment. China has tremendous problems with air and water pollution. The Chinese Academy of Environmental Planning produced a report a few months ago saying that environmental damage in China last year cost $230 billion. China spent in 2011 $68 billion on alternative forms of energy to reduce the dependence on coal and fuels that produce lots of air pollution. The study estimates that by the year 2020, China will have to spend $243 billion a year on new technologies to try and promote cleaner air and reduce all the air pollution we've seen there in recent months. So environment will also be a major challenge, an expensive challenge for the Chinese economy going out over the next 5 or 10 years. Fifth area of development, fifth area of change, is the status of the RMB as a global currency. The RMB historically has played no role whatsoever in global financial markets. Because China's currency is not fully convertible, the RMB has been a national currency. It's not been a global currency. But there have been major changes in the last 2 or 3 years to promote a wider global role for the Chinese RMB. There are now 10,000 financial institutions globally who do business in the RMB compared to only 900 2 years ago. The share of trade, Chinese trade, which is RMB denominated, has grown from 2% in 2009 to 12% last year. And the bank HSBC estimates that by 2015, 1/3 of all Chinese trade will be RMB denominated. Because the RMB is not yet fully convertible, it can't really play the role of a reserve currency like the US dollar or the European currency. But some developing countries now, for the first time, are buying the RMB as an asset for their foreign exchange reserves. In the last year, we've seen both Malaysia and Nigeria buy several billion RMB for the first time as a way to diversify their foreign exchange reserves. So this is a very important development in the global financial system, and it means, looking out 10 or 15 years, the RMB will become an important global currency for both denominating trade and denominating foreign exchange reserves. China's economy slowed down last year. The growth rate went from 10 or 11% back in 2010 to only about 7.5%. There have been some signs in recent months the economy is improving. Chinese central bank conducted a survey of business confidence last week, and the index rose to 68 in the month of March from 60.4 in December. But there is right now a major debate going on about the outlook for the Chinese economy. And there are two schools of thought. One is we had a temporary cyclical slowdown last year, which will not continue in 2013 and 14. It was caused by weaker foreign trade and an attempt to try and restrict real estate inflation by reducing property investment. China's government was very, very concerned about large increases in property values because that does discourage home ownership. But now they have loosened up on these policies, and Chinese exports have actually done pretty well in the last few months. So these economists are confident that China can easily have a growth rate again this year of 8.5%. In fact, the OECD in Paris came out with a report of the Chinese economy last year forecasting exactly that. The other school of thought focuses on the fact that China has an exceptionally high investment share of GDP. The investment share of GDP in recent times has been 48-49%, the highest of any country in the modern period. At the top of the great East Asian economic boom back in 1997, Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia all got to 40%, but no one got to 48%. And these economists believe that China's had massive overinvestment and therefore now has a lot of excess capacity. and capital spending will therefore have to fall quite sharply. And this could drive the Chinese growth rate down from 8 or 8.5% to only 3 or 4%. And we don't yet know the full answer to this question. The fact is, because China's had record capital spending, there probably is some vulnerability. The Chinese government has shown here in the last year it can keep promoting investment by infrastructure spending and policies like that. So we won't know, I think, for at least 1 or 2 more years exactly which side is right in this debate. But it will have profound consequences for the regional economy because China has become, in the last decade, the most important trading partner of many countries in this region. China right now takes 54% of Hong Kong's exports, 29% of Australia's exports, 27% of Taiwan's exports, 24% of Korea's exports, and 20% of Japan's exports. And these exports are very much centered in the area we call intermediate goods. China and Japan, well, I should say Japan and Korea and Taiwan supply to China a wide range of components and parts which are used to assemble finished goods, which China then exports to North America and Europe. If we look at Korea's trade account, intermediate goods account for 61% of all Korean exports and 72% of Korea's exports to China. So if we do have a major Chinese slowdown centering on both domestic consumption and exports, that will, of course, have an adverse effect on the trade of this country as well as Taiwan and Japan, major suppliers of goods to China. Elsewhere in Asia, the growth rate's been pretty good. Korea and Taiwan have been weak in the last year because of foreign trade, but we've had good growth rates in Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, because we've had very robust growth in domestic consumption to compensate for weaker exports. Indonesia's had a capital spending boom because of lots of mineral developments. The Philippine government is spending lots of money on infrastructure because Philippines for many years did not spend enough. Malaysia has an election pending in a few months. The Malaysian government had a very aggressive fiscal policy last year to try and buy votes. The other truly weak economy in Asia right now is India. Their growth rate's gone from over 8% down to about 5%. And India's had 2 major problems. First, they had a very high inflation rate a year ago, so the Indian Reserve Bank raised interest rates 13 times to try and bring inflation under control. They've had some success, and therefore they've begun to cut interest rates here in the last few months. But they're doing it very, very gradually. They'll probably cut interest rates this year only 50 or 75 basis points. They won't reverse all of what they did back in 2010 and 2011. And secondly, India has had major corruption scandals. This has very much crippled business confidence and led to a big decline in capital spending. And there's no simple way to resolve this issue because India has had some huge scandals involving construction projects for the Commonwealth Games, telecom licenses being sold, and more recently the sale of some coal leases. So with corruption looming as a major, major issue, this does very much make it difficult for Indian businessmen to make investment decisions. India will also have an election a year from now, and right now no one's really in command. Prime Minister Singh is over 80 years old. It's far from clear he can run again. Democratic Party or the BJP Party, the Hindu Nationalist Party, also has to elect a new leader. And right now it's not clear who's going to win. So India will have, going into 2014, lots and lots of political uncertainty. If we turn to Latin America, the economic outlook is also mixed. We've got very robust growth in Peru, Chile, Colombia, on the back of big new resource investments in copper mines, gold mines, and coal mines. Brazilian economy, by contrast, has weakened quite dramatically. Brazil had a very major inflation problem a year ago. They raised interest rates quite dramatically. That did constrain growth here in the last several months. And when they had high interest rates, the Brazilian real went up by 40% against the U.S. in just 2 years. And this also had an adverse effect on Brazil's competitive position. I think Brazil's growth rate will improve this year, but it may be only 3 or 3.5% compared to 1% last year and over 7% back in 2010. The other promising region of the world, which doesn't get enough press coverage, is sub-Saharan Africa. We've now had 4 or 5 years in which sub-Saharan growth has been over 5%. The exception, of course, was during the global recession in 2009. But Africa looks like it's now entering upon a period of sustained takeoff. And a variety of factors are driving this. First, demand for raw materials. Because of China's rise as a major economic power, they've now got very strong demand for copper, iron ore, all base metals, plus oil. Africa produces lots of these minerals that's now attracting lots of Chinese investment. Sino-African trade has gone from $10 billion 12 years ago to now over $200 billion. China's become a very important growth locomotive for the African continent. Secondly, there's been a major improvement over the last 10 years in the quality of African political governance. 20 years ago, we classified 3 African countries as democratic. Now we classify 31 as either fully democratic or partly democratic. This is a very, very major change. And it does mean in Africa an improvement in the quality of political leadership, in transparency, in honesty, a strengthening of the rule of law. That's an essential prerequisite for a continent to be able to attract lots of FDI. And because of the resource boom, because of these political changes, Africa now is attracting reasonable amounts of FDI for resource development. In addition, Africa is unique among the countries of the world, the regions of the world, in having lots of population growth. The population will go from 1 billion people last year to possibly as many as 2 billion by the year 2050. This will be both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is if they can't create jobs, this will simply lead to widespread poverty and pressure for immigration. The opportunity is they've got abundant labor supplies, and therefore they should be a place where companies can go that have labor shortages at home. And right now we are looking at labor shortages in China, much of East Asia, certainly in Europe because of a declining population in Germany, Italy, Spain, countries like that. So this could be an opportunity for African countries to attract not just mining investment, but at some point in the future, manufacturing investment as well. So Africa now is a very interesting growth opportunity, and one I think very much the Korean companies should focus on, because Africa could be a great consumer of construction services, of manufactured goods, as well as financial services. So that's my summary of the global economy. It is going to be in the year ahead a time of great challenge, but also a great opportunity. America has the potential for a better growth rate if it can resolve its fiscal problems. Europe is trapped in recession because of all the contradictions tied to the monetary union. But Japan could have in the year ahead a much higher growth rate, 1.5% plus, compared to 3 quarters in a row, which were recently negative. And China, I think, has plenty of potential to get back to a growth rate of 8 to 8.5% in the year ahead, after having had a modest downturn in the year 2012. Why don't I stop there, and we can take the next 10 minutes for any questions you have on these points or any others.
With this, we have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&As. After that, David Hale has scheduled for interviews and the many other things. Yes, make your questions quite short. And yes.
You have mentioned of last year's publication by World Bank about China 2030s. And last year, Jurlick, the governor at that time, he has mentioned about without drastic reform, especially state-owned enterprises in China. We call it the state capitalism, and so without drastic reform of these SOEs, the weight and the contribution, China might be fall into so-called middle income traps sometimes. So thereafter, even Li Ka-ching, he used to be as a deputy premier supported for these directions. And you have just mentioned about that. So I think at this moment, among various kind of challenges and problems in China, especially this sort of SOEs function and weight and their contribution is increasing so sharply, and that might be sometimes the problematic situation in China. So would you give your opinion and forecast about this subject.
Thank you, Dr. Hale. I'll ask 3 quick questions. First, in the U.S. sequestration, originally it was thought to be so dreadful, 2 parties will be compelled to come to agreement to avoid it. Now, nevertheless, we are now in sequestrations. And you estimated it has an impact of reducing the U.S. GDP from 3% to 2%. Do you think they will now muddle along under the sequestration rather than trying to solve any other way? That's first question in the U.S. Second, in the Europe, this Cyprus crisis is the first time they came to solve the problem by making the depositors to pay for it. Now, I understand the reasons behind it, but nevertheless, the impact is this is very rattling for total banking system because up till now, the depositors always felt the deposits are safe, the other people may not be. The third question is, Li Keqiang was quoted to have said a few years back, if you are interested in Chinese GDP, GDP numbers are man-made, meaning that it's not reliable. So you have to really look at the real factors like electric consumption, car loading, and the bank loans. How comfortable do you feel about the Chinese GDP numbers as published by the government? Thank you.
First of all, thanks, Mr. Hale, for a lovely overview. In this room full of economists and businessmen, I am a non-economist and non-businessman. I'm the ambassador of India. I have a very quick question and a layman's question, really. You mentioned the positive signs in the US, and which is very encouraging because for most of the countries, including India, the economic health of US is very important. I was just wondering, would you like to also touch upon how will US in the medium to long term handle its deficit? There are huge deficits. And they are continuing, and we are talking of $1 trillion deficits every year. So they are adding up. So how is it that the balance sheet is going to be sorted out somewhere along the line? And to add to that, you mentioned the challenge that Japan has of old infrastructure. I would think US also has a similar challenge of old infrastructure. And I was reading somewhere that according to some estimates, the requirement for infrastructure renewal is something like $1 trillion. And then lastly, the public spending, whenever there is a little effort to cut the public spending, there is a hue and cry, obviously. So how does it all add up? Thank you.
Okay. Those are all quite demanding questions. Let me start first with the state enterprises in China. China's state enterprises have had profound changes in the last 15 years. Many have now been partly privatized and listed on the stock exchange, but the government is still the dominant shareholder. That's true of the banks, the oil companies, a whole range of different enterprises. But it's widely accepted now in China that the state-owned enterprises do have preferential biases for access to bank lending, access to capital, access to good land, a whole range of different things which are important to the cost of doing business. So that is now an issue very much in play. And there's lots of criticism. There's a book that just came out from the former editor of the Wall Street Journal in China, Richard McGregor, about China's state-owned enterprises. Now this will pose, over the next 5 or 10 years, a very, very major challenge for policymakers. As the World Bank indicates, the change must occur. So I think all we can do is watch and see what happens. There's also the problem that China has industrial policies that favor certain sectors over others and can lead to major market distortions. A good example of this is solar power. China created, 10 years ago, several new solar power companies. They have preferential access to credit, land, tax preferences. And by 2010, these companies became dominant in the global solar power industry, and they drove down prices dramatically, bankrupting solar power companies in the United States and Western Europe. This led the U.S. government a year ago to impose tariffs on Chinese solar power imports, over 30%. This, in turn, has had a very adverse effect on those companies. And 2 weeks ago, China's largest solar power company, one with a market cap of several $billion 3 years ago, went bankrupt. That was Suntan. So that's an example of the Chinese government policy that in the end backfired. So I see in the U.S.-China relationship now lots of what I call microeconomic tensions. And it will be over these policies which favor certain sectors with preferential capital, low tax rates, things like that. Now, you had this process in Korea 50 years ago with the Shables. You nurtured strong companies to be global players, and that policy over 30 and 40 years was quite successful. Japan did the same thing back in the 1950s. So it's not surprising China is following that example. But China's economy is now much larger than Korea or Japan's were 30 and 40 years ago. And therefore, when they become a major factor in a market, as they have with solar power, that leads to much more in the way of trade tensions. So it'll be an incremental process. But I think that the fact that the World Bank has this report out, it's over 500 pages long, the fact that Premier Lee played a role in writing it, tells me there will be reforms, but it will take time. Your three questions. Just remind me again. The first was on sequestration. Yeah, the consensus was when sequestration was announced 15 months ago or 18 months ago, it wouldn't be allowed to happen. But as I mentioned in my talk, we've got a terrible political gridlock in Washington right now affecting both parties. Republicans don't want any tax increases. Democrats don't want to cut the entitlement programs. I was in Washington last week, and I had some private conversations with members of both parties about what they could do. And the Republicans told me privately, they will not say it publicly, if President Obama will agree to big cuts to the entitlement programs, they'll agree to tax increases. They won't say that publicly right now, but if they get a good deal from the president, they'd compromise. The White House told me they're prepared to reduce the indexation payments for Social Security by $220 billion over the next 10 years. They've not said that publicly. They told me privately they could do that. So we do have in both parties some willingness to do a deal. But we have to find some way to bring it all together. And it's very, very difficult. It's what we would call a grand bargain. And as of today, a grand bargain is not in sight. Well, we'll once again have to raise our government debt ceiling in August. That's what led to sequestration 2 years ago. So I'm hoping that deadline in August might finally force a big compromise. And that would help us solve the problem.
Cyprus.
Oh, yes. As I mentioned in my talk, what happened with Cyprus 2 weeks ago was totally unprecedented. To make depositors in a bank suffer large losses. So far, when banks have been rescued in Europe, the losses have only fallen on the equity holders and the bond holders, not on depositors. So this will have a catastrophic impact on Cyprus's banking business. Now, the Dutch finance minister, who's the president of the Euro group that negotiates these deals, said 2 weeks ago, very stupidly in my opinion, Cyprus could be a template for future action. And when he said that, European bank stocks fell by 10% across the board the same day. What he said was really stupid. I think he said it because he's very inexperienced. He only became finance minister in October after an election. He's never played any role in Europe before. When the Luxembourg finance minister stepped down from being head of the Euro group in January, he got that position. And he now has to learn how to conduct himself. He hasn't done that yet. Because there's no way the rest of Europe would do this. It would be catastrophic. And the danger, of course, is because he made the suggestion, there could be in the next few months capital flight from Portugal and Spain, countries that have potential vulnerability to a banking crisis. So this issue is still very much in play. But I think what happened in Cyprus will not happen anywhere else. Cyprus is a very special situation because of all the Russian money. And the fact there was so much press coverage of that fact in the German press. Angela Merkel could not rescue Russian billionaires. She can only rescue European companies and European citizens. Your third question? There's lots of debate about Chinese GDP. Morgan Stanley had a report that came out just a month or two ago estimating that right now the Chinese data understates the consumption share of GDP by 10%. That they rely on lots of old data and aren't keeping up with the big changes going on in the Chinese economy. They fail to capture in their retail sales numbers internet transactions, which in China now are quite large. They also don't fully understand how people are changing their consumption patterns because they have old data series. So the answer is there are lots of problems with Chinese economic numbers, but they cut both ways. Some overstate growth and some understate growth. and we don't yet know the full answer as to how it all would work out. We had, during the Asian financial crisis back in 1998, China's power consumption fell quite dramatically. But China's GDP growth rate never got under 8%. And many economists felt that was a contradiction. That in fact growth must have been a lot weaker, but they simply weren't showing it in the data. So Chinese numbers can be misleading. It's a valid concern. And again, the fact that Lee said this does give me hope they may improve the data. You know, we have to revise our GDP data in the United States every 5 years. We revise everything going back 4 or 5 years, and sometimes there are some quite major changes. So data revisions aren't limited to China. They're very much a phenomenon for the whole industrial world. Your question on the U.S. fiscal deficit, the Congressional Budget Office is forecasting over the next 3 years, the deficit will fall quite dramatically, from almost 10% of GDP 3 years ago to possibly as low as 3% of GDP in the year 2015. Because with the economy doing better, we're getting growth in tax receipts. The two problems after that are Medicare and interest costs. Medicare goes up in cost every year because of an aging population. That could easily drive us back to a deficit more like 5% of GDP. And the second potential risk is interest rates. Right now, America spends 1.5% of GDP on debt servicing, compared to 3% 20 years ago. Because of low interest rates, the government's debt servicing costs have collapsed. When we someday again have normal interest rates, not the Fed funds rate at 0, but the Fed funds rate at 4 or 4.5%, our government borrowing costs could double or even triple. So by 2020, debt servicing costs might be 4% of GDP, not 1.5. And that'll mean a big increase in government spending, which will collide with the other fiscal targets. The Republican goal is to freeze the government share of GDP at 20% forever. And you simply can't do that if your debt servicing costs triple and your population keeps aging, boosting Medicare benefits. I think it's going to be very, very hard going out 5 years to keep the government share of GDP below 25%. I think it's going to increase because of these demographic changes and interest payment changes. And I think for Medicare, the big question is, will we have to introduce a value-added tax to pay for Medicare? Right now, the U.S. is the only industrial country not to have a value-added tax. It started out in Europe 30 years ago. Now it's in Canada. It's in Australia. It's become truly global. But the U.S. has never had a value-added tax. We've talked about it from time to time, but it goes nowhere. The last congressman to endorse the idea was Al Ullman back in 1978. He was very powerful. He was the Democratic chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. But because he proposed that idea, he lost his seat in the next election. So since that time, no one's dared propose it. But if Medicare goes from 4% of GDP to 10% over the next 25 years, the only way we could raise that much money to fund a huge increase in health care spending is a value-added tax, because there'd be great resistance to raising income tax rates. We cut our income tax rates quite dramatically in the 1980s. Before 1980, our top marginal tax rate was 70%. Reagan went to 50 in 1980. He went to 28% in 1986. Then it went back to 31, and under Clinton it went back to 40, but not back all the way to 50. There'd be great resistance to that. So I think if we can't control Medicare spending, we'll be forced to join the rest of the world in having a value-added tax. So it's an evolving story. And the problem is that the two parties are very far apart in terms of their core interests and their perceptions of what they have to do to maintain the support of their voters. I think both parties know privately what they have to do, but they can't admit it publicly. That's the challenge.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here. You can take advantage of his encyclopedic the knowledge of all these global and financial matters. But we have to let him go, and we have to stop here. And we appreciate very much for your very illuminating and insightful presentation.
Say one thing.
Yeah.
If you'd like a copy of my comments on the global economy, just give me your business card, and I can send it to you later.
Yeah. By the way, he is now he established his own Chicago-based consulting the group called David Hale Global Economics, Global Economics, and he's actually based in Chicago. And also, he wrote most often quoted book on the China some time ago. It's a China Takes Off, which actually this is an article that's published in Foreign Affairs in 2003. It's a very often quoted article. And also he recently wrote a book together with his wife, who is again a distinguished economist, and wrote a book titled What's Next? And Unconventional Wisdom on the Future of the Global Economy, which was published last year by Yale University Press. So why don't you pick up a copy and you'll get all the most recent the information on global economy. Well, before we end, I just want to the announcement. Again, in front of you, you have this invitation card. It's about the fostering hidden champions lessons from German experience. Actually, here, this is very exceptional. The conference. Mikhail Fox, who is second man in the German parliament. He's the very close associate of the Chancellor Merkel. And he actually very, very interesting person. He has a doctorate degree in biology, and he actually established his own companies, became one of the hidden champions in Germany, and then he turned into politician and he became very, very successful. And he will come here to give the German experiences on this so-called the German hidden champions. And along with the German experts, so we will have our Minister of Industry and Trade and also the small and medium industry. The administration head will be with us. Please join us. And then before that, next Tuesday, on April 9th, Hugh Patricks and Jerry Curtis, as a leading economist and the political scientist, the experts on Japanese economy and politics. And you know Hugh Patricks, and from both of them are very distinguished professors in Columbia University. At the same time, Jerry lives in Tokyo for some time, and Hugh Patrick run the Japan Research Institute at Columbia. So both of them will talk about the Japanese economy and politics, and please they join us there. Well, with this, please join me in thanking David Hale. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.